Where's the? I think she's going to take some people.
Good one.
She's supposed to be down. God's supposed to be meeting with her down in the. All right.
You know, she's struggling though. She can do all that stuff now.
I know. Anyway. This thing. Remember we had an issue with this last time? It's you. No, it's not. It's made for a woman, not a man. Man can go this way.
It's not female or male oriented.
It's hiding behind them.
It's operator here.
Thank you, Benign.
I want to stop. Transition time. Clinic now? Okay. All right, did everybody hear that? If you access to the vaccine, what days though? Or okay. But here, the Guadalupe Clinic, I think. Yeah. But they're facilitating the community center. Okay. So if we can get a hold of Mitzi. Mitzi can get special connections to come on through and to get that vaccine if you haven't already and you'd like to do that. So thank you for pointing that out. I think she tried to call me this week, but I missed her phone call.
You don't need to make reservations for an appointment anymore.
Okay. Can you go through line more than once? Just keep going. Like,
no.
Every day.
We already know about the
reasons. There's actually a couple, like, I thought it was like cities or some sort. They're like offering $100 or something. Shoot. When did they start doing that? I'm going to come and do weeks ago. Oh, tickets to baseball games? I'm going to get one of those prosthetic. I'm like, Kristen, can you pick me one of those prosthetic arms up at the hospital so I can come and just keep getting stuck? All right, are you good, Kristen? All right. I already did the message with my wife, so she's on the same page. She's going to do a little children's version of this. Hey, open up to 1 Samuel chapter 25. I never preached on this woman before, but she actually has she holds the record for the longest speech of any woman in the Old Testament. Probably the whole Bible. I forget, I don't know if it's the New Testament too, but it's definitely the Old Testament. Abigail in 1 Samuel chapter 25. I think it would be really worth reading pretty much the whole chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 25, Abigail. It's a lot of verses, but it's the story. So I know some pastors try to summarize it for you, but I think you should just kind of read through and then I'll go back through. And so today's message, really, Abigail had to deal with some very difficult men in her life, and she did it very successfully. So I think there's some things, women, that you can learn. I talked with my wife about this. There's some things that you can learn from Abigail about how to deal with emotional men, or men that lose self-control, or men that are difficult. So if you've ever found yourself in that situation, I think we can learn a couple things from Abigail. So I'll focus on David's weaknesses and failures and see if I can improve. And men, I encourage you to do that. But women, let's see what we can learn from Abigail's life, okay? Now, 1 Samuel chapter 25, let's go ahead and read through this, and I'll just break it down. I'll keep this really simple. I need to ask you a couple questions. So once we read through this, I'm going to ask you a couple questions because I want to hear from you. 1 Samuel 25, verse 2. A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy, and he had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. Now, okay, so this is in the southern part of Israel, David was born in the south. David's band of followers are roaming around in the south. It's directly west of the Dead Sea, southern Israel. Okay? His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman. I think that's NIV. But her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Caleb. Thank you. Yes. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is of yours.' Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we didn't mistreat them. The whole time they were with us at Carmel, nothing was missing. Ask your own servants, and they'll tell you. Therefore, please be favorable toward my men, since we've come at a very festive time of the year. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." He is being very humble. When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and they waited. But Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? And who is this son of Jesse? You know, many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I give my bread and water and the meat that I have slaughtered from my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" So David's men turned around and went back. And when they arrived, they reported every word. And David said to those men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did. And David strapped on his as well. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. Now, one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were in the fields, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were like a wall around us, while we were herding our sheep near them. Now think this over quickly and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his entire household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Now Abigail, verse 18, she acted very quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seeds of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, loaded them on donkeys, and told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow behind." And she did not tell her husband at all. As she came riding her donkey into the mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It has been useless, all of my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing was missing, and he has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, or be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." Let me just stop there for a second. I'll get back to this. But the literal phrase on this is very interesting. The literal phrase, it doesn't say, "If I leave alive one male of all who belong." It says, "If I leave alive one," how do I put this? "One person who urinates on the wall." The literal phrase in Hebrew is he who urinates on the wall. Okay, which is, if you think about it, female can't do it. So technically, the translator is saying, obviously, he's talking about men here. He's going to try to kill all the servants in house. So it's really interesting Hebrew, and you don't find things like that when you're reading the English version. All right, 23. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey, and she bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say." Now, I tell my wife all the time, these are biblical phrases. Please use biblical phrases when you're addressing them. "Please pay no attention, my lord." Yeah. Okay. "To that wicked man, Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means folly, a fool, and folly goes with him. As for me, your servant, I did not see the man my Lord sent. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And let this gift," the food that she's bringing, "which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. She uses my Lord 11 times here. It's significant. I'll mention it a little bit later. There's a number of components of this speech. But here's David's response, 32. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Remember, God says, do not take revenge. David kind of knew this, but in this case, he was emotional. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in his house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like stone. I think he probably had a stroke, maybe, and maybe that led to a coma. I don't know. But 10 days later, it says the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Then David heard that Nabal was dead, and said, praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to the Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife. She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, I am your servant, and I am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants. Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married, there's 2 other women. It was actually his 3rd wife. Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Michal, David's wife, who was the daughter of King Saul. All right, so let me ask you just an initial question. Why do you think David asked Abigail to marry him? What attracted him to her? What did he admire about Abigail? Any thoughts? I can repeat back, Carolyn, if you want me to, and then you don't have to. Any thoughts? What stands out to you? What made her faithfulness, servant's heart, okay.
She was obviously very intelligent.
Wisdom, intelligence, right?
She recognized it.
Okay. She had a spiritual perception. I think she knew who David was, and she recognized the calling on his life. Sure. I think in that sense, maybe she was kind of prophetic, like, you know. Okay, what else stands out about her character that was a positive?
She did the right thing, and she did it against her husband, but knew when to go against her husband. She did not set the
Oh, okay. Right. That was very risky.
Yeah.
And we're going to mention that because that was basically helping her husband's enemy. And that was a very risky thing to do for a woman, especially in that day, falling under such a man, a wicked man, and also, under his authority with that kind of confrontation. So she was quick-witted. She was a peacemaker. She was truthful. Okay. Yep. Humble. That's kind of what you had mentioned. So, generous, very generous. Let me ask you this, because Kristen got this instantly. What do you think was her greatest sorrow in life? Bad marriage, right? A marriage to a bad man. Okay. Yes. Kristen hit that nail right on the head. She was mismatched. Let's just say she was mismatched with her husband, right? How do you think she felt, and how do you think women in Abigail's position cope with something like that? Any thoughts? Suffer in silence? Okay.
Navigate day by day.
Day by day. Don't even, yep, just try to get through one day at a time, okay? All right. I would, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. I could see a revengeful spirit. I could see bitterness. The temptation. I don't see that in Abigail, but I could see a revengeful spirit or bitterness or like an unforgiveness. The temptation for that to really poison the woman's soul potentially.
And learning what I have over the years about alcoholism and the fact that he's obviously a drinker,
Okay.
you learn to be the peacemaker, to always kind of go one step in front and keep things from being an issue that would create anger or what. And so I think that probably helped her to learn to be the peacemaker. And you just, like she said, day by day.
Yeah, I did not pick up on that thought because my family, my father did not, so I've never really been exposed. But that is a very good insight. So, all right. So let me just give you some background real quick. So Nabal is very wealthy. I wish I brought a map, but Carmel is at the very bottom, and it's where David and his band of 600 outlaws are kind of roaming. Now David was a shepherd. He knows about shearing sheep. Shearing sheep is a very festive time of the year. What did it say? He has 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. So this man is very, very wealthy, very wealthy. And David is a shepherd of shepherds, so he's protecting the shepherds and he's protecting the sheep because he's been in their shoes. You know, he's taking care of them. He tells his men, don't touch a single sheep, don't steal from, just take care of them, protect them, be a security force for the manservants. And he basically sends a delegation of like 10 men. And it has an informal, it's kind of like an informal treaty. You send a delegation, you provide greetings, you rehearse the history of your relationship together, which he basically informs them what they've been doing, and he humbly requests compensation for the security and protection, but he does it very humbly. He says, David, your son. Okay, so he humbles himself below the vault, even though I would argue David is the most well-known, famous, and most powerful man in that area. But yet he still puts himself under Nabal. Okay? Now, Nabal, did you guys catch that? His name means foolish. Now, that can be interpreted either like emotional or intellectual foolishness. So he just makes emotional decisions that are, or he intellectually is just not a very wise man. But either way, even ethically, he's just does not making wise decisions. And he basically offends the most powerful man in the area who's got 600 warriors, and he's the killer of giants, Right. A speedboat versus a battleship, correct? Yes. All right. So because of greed or arrogance, I have no idea. Now, we look at David's response. It's immediate. What spirit would you categorize David's response as? What's the first word?
Vengeful.
Vengeful. Revengeful. Yes. Angry. Yep. Yeah, I think of emotion. And usually David is pretty, it's pretty self-controlled. Think about his relationship with Saul. For those of you who know David's life, David's been put in many situations already where he did not take the life of his enemies. He exercised self-control. I heard something this week that really stuck with me. I'm like, wow, this is great. Love this. I'm going to use this more. And Kristen's like, yeah, I already knew this. It's no big deal. But I never thought of patience or self-control like a muscle. So when you exercise a muscle, eventually, if you do it too much, it's going to fatigue. And so patience or self-control, I can feel this. Like I get it. I can exercise self-control, exercise patience, and then eventually it just snaps. Like you just get to the point where I don't have any more strength in that muscle anymore, and I lose it. And I think David, unless there's some way of balancing your life and you're being refreshed or satisfied, he just got to the point with all that was going on in his life, he reacted. And it was kind of a desire for revenge. Do you know the golden rule? Do to others as you would have them do to you. That's really easy when people are nice to you and you be nice. But when people are evil to you or unfair to you, it's really hard to do good in return. But God says, don't seek revenge, right? So looking at verse 14 through 17, because we're kind of just moving through this, and I've got some principles at the very end. One of the servants, I can just picture him, he just runs back to the house as fast as he possibly can. And it's obvious that of all of the servants, who had the best relationship with the servants in the household? Paul or Abigail did, right? And we learned some very positive things about David's servant. The men were good to us. They didn't mistreat us. This is verse 15. Nothing was missing. Night and day, they were like a wall around us. I love that. That protective element. It seems like Abigail's got a great relationship with her servants. And even the servants know about Nabal's character and wickedness. Wicked thing, verse 17. All right, so she acts really quickly. I don't know how big this household is, but we're talking 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine. I picture like, how big is a skin of wine? Like the animal? I don't know.
5 gallons.
Okay, so let's just say, let's say 10 gallons. So we got 10 gallons of wine, probably for the leaders, 200 loaves of bread, 5 dressed sheep. I don't know if they were cooked or not uncooked still, if you were.
Dress means ready for.
That's what I sort of, but I don't know if she had time. And five baskets. I heard that it's about 60 pounds of roasted grain. You know how we snack on like nuts or something? You know, it's kind of like roasted grain is kind of like a snack. Remember Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields, they pulled off, and those were uncooked. This is roasted. So this is like a little snack. And you've got 100 cakes of raisins and 200 cakes of pressed figs. Now, I'm not quite sure. We had 600 men with David. I don't know if their families were with them. If some of them were married, were their wives with them, were their children, I'm not sure. This probably was not enough to provide an entire meal for everyone, but it was a significant gift. Okay? And she follows behind the gift, because you want to give a gift first, and then you want to explain. You don't want to try explaining. Let's settle them down, you know. She comes riding into the mountain ravine. David's coming down. He says, it's been useless. This guy's taking back evil for good. And I'm going to basically eliminate every single male who belongs to his household. So David's angry. He's vindictive. He feels insulted for all the good that he's done. And as I mentioned, self-control and patience, muscle. Do we ever struggle with the same feeling? Like we're doing our neighbor good, we're helping, and we're not returned. It's not fair. There's not, people are not treating us as we're treating.
It's called resentment.
Resentment. Okay. I can kind of, but let me ask you this: what was David's motive for serving? What does that give us? What insight do we gain? Because based on David's reaction, what was his motive in serving Nabal and protecting the sheep? Was it unconditional love? To get something in return. And that's frankly something that I struggle with in my marriage or in any relationship. How do we unconditionally love without expecting anything in return? Versus I'm doing something, I'm doing the dishes because I want something back. I want to trade. So David's reaction basically reveals that his motivation for service is not unconditional love. All right. Now we have the longest speech, basically, of any woman in the Old Testament here, from verse 24 all the way through 31. And I see just as components of her speech, she basically accepts blame, even though it's not her responsibility. She says, pardon me, if I would have known, if I would have intercepted your messengers, I would have taken immediate action. She assumes moral responsibility, even though it's kind of her husband's fault. And she actually steps in and protects her husband and her household. She softens David's heart with her actions and words. She basically asks for forgiveness. She encourages David with a vision of his future. And she prevents David from tarnishing his reputation for the rest of his life. I think that's really, can you, looking back, if David would have had that on his conscience for the next 30 to 40 years, that had just been a bad part of their story. So she plays a very invaluable role. What's really interesting about the phrase "my Lord," which comes up 11 times here, "my Lord" can be applied to a male in various positions of authority, like a king. In this particular case, okay, let me ask you a question, ladies. Verse 31. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. What does she mean by that? And when God has brought you success and you become king, remember your servant. What do you think what is she asking for?
You would have gotten there and had him for your service, potentially.
What kind of blessing is she? She's helping him out. Yeah. She said, I'm doing you a favor. You do me a favor. But what do you think she? Huh?
Sometimes you just want to be thanked.
Okay. What? Okay. David is a married man with 2 wives. This woman is a married woman. What can a married man do for for a married woman? When she's saying, when God's brought you success and He elevates you and you become king, remember your servant. Remember this moment that I helped you out. What do you think she's asking for in return? What can a married man legitimately give a married woman?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
He could also have a conversation to the man and he can protect her in that kind of way too.
Okay, maybe future protection to some degree. Okay.
Well, I was thinking too that in that day when her husband died, she would have nothing. So in the future, if her husband passed away,
If her husband passed away in the future,
and help her once
sure,
she's a widow.
that's a potential. Sure. Yep. And that's basically what happened. The other thing is, think about Brittany with her 2 children. Take care of my kids. Yeah, if anything happens to me, I want you to, or look, you can't do anything. I'm a married woman, but what you can do is you can bring my kids to Jerusalem and employ them in your service. You can elevate them in a position as a favor to me. Get my kids in the royal household, get them educated, and put them in a place of faith. But here's what's so interesting. She uses "my Lord" 11 times. There's another. You know how that can be used. Another way that you can. It was. Do you remember Sarah when she said? You probably remember this, Kitty. She called her Abraham. Remember what she called Abraham? This exact phrase. Okay? So it can mean my husband. So it's just interesting. It's just an interesting play of words where she says, if I just substitute that, and when the Lord your God has brought my husband success, remember me. Now, I don't think she was trying to say that, but that phrase can be applied between a respectful term between a wife and her authority, her spiritual authority, like the head, her protection, her husband. And that's eventually what happened. All right, so David responds positively to Abigail. He is reminded that vengeance belongs to God and God alone. We've got to forgive, we've got to let it go. Sometimes it's hard to do, but we've got to give the issues that we face over to God, let Him deal with them in His way. All right? Now, finishing up, she tells Nabal, her husband, the next day. He's oblivious of danger, totally oblivious. He was drunk that evening, and eventually, I think he had a stroke, maybe. I don't know medically how you could describe this, that led to a coma, and then eventually death. So the Lord, in His timing, administered divine judgment upon Nabal for David's sake. And as we talked about, David was so impressed with Abigail that he decided to take her home to be his wife. He initiated that And she came with 5 female servants. You know this woman was rich. And David, technically, since he now married the widow, he had authority. He took possession of the man's wealth and household. Okay, so that was a significant addition to David's position of power and wealth. He's not the king yet. He's not the king, but that was certainly a step in the right direction. Now, here's another interesting thing. That both of these we're talking about, this is near Bethlehem where David was born. This is in the area where David grew up. It is highly likely that Nabal and David were relatives. And I even saw one commentator make this point. What happens when, do you remember the story of Ruth and Boaz? Okay, when a husband dies and a woman hasn't had a son yet, what is the closest of kin basically to do? Is raise up an heir. I don't know if it's marriage or, well, I don't know. Okay, anyway, so I don't know on that part. But raise up a male heir for her and for her household. And I saw one commentator that said specifically, David could have been Abigail's kinsman redeemer. He's the closest relative. And here's why. Because when we read further in Samuel and in the Kings, we never read of Abigail's son being a contender for the throne. He's never a contender for the throne. So either A, he died, or B, he was never legitimately viewed as David's son. He was viewed as David was doing an act, even toward his enemies perhaps, or maybe out of love for Abigail and her dead husband to raise up a son for that household, and he didn't really view it as a personal marriage, so to speak. It was more of a duty thing. And that's why Caleb, who was Abigail's son, never was a contender for the throne. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, so let me wrap up. Here's some final. What do we learn about Abigail, about living and working with the weaknesses of men? I want to just throw that question out there. Any initial thoughts as we conclude? I wrote down some thoughts myself, but what do we learn from Abigail about living and working with the weaknesses of men? What do we see that Abigail did well?
Start with their ego. You humble her.
Okay.
I mean, she came at it very on her knees with the food, everything out in front. She addressed his ego before she addressed what she wanted.
She was very wise to do that. Do you know what I have found? I have found that the most mature person is the one that initiates and is usually perceived to be the most humble. So in this particular case, because she initiated and she did it in a very humble way, it shows me that she had the greatest maturity when you look at Abigail versus David. I think there was a lot of wisdom. Yeah. Okay, anyone else? Any other thoughts? What do we learn about living with the weaknesses of men? Living, working with, any other thoughts?
Of course, the men are supposed to do that.
Come on, we haven't heard some people. Any other thoughts? What do we learn? What encouragement can we get out of Abigail's life? I want you to think principles, think.
Pastor, when she came to David, she was essentially saying, don't take this into your own hands, trust God to deal with it.
Forgive me.
I think that being married to Nabal, she had to learn that lesson for herself.
Wow. Yes.
She was asking for mercy for her husband's actions.
Yeah.
That was the gift.
And he was, can you imagine if he beat her or whatever, and then she's still interceding for her husband? She was an intercessor, that's a pretty powerful. I don't get any taste. I believe when I read the story, I know that Abigail knows who Nabal is, but I don't get any taste of bitterness or revenge in her spirit. I know she just plainly knows that he's a fool and that he's wicked, but I don't feel like it's poisoned her heart, And did you have a thought?
If you stay humble, a lot can be accomplished.
Okay.
She let the household know that she was kind and generous and humble. They obviously knew that she could, accomplish what they needed done. They always went to her first, probably, about everything. And she was very humble, and she did a lot behind the scenes to keep the peace, to make sure that her household was well taken care of and treated as best she could manage. And, they rewarded her, I would with that, for her kindness and her wisdom and her peacemaking abilities. That way, I think God took care of her in spite of her husband.
So let me summarize just with a couple thoughts that I wrote down as I was thinking about this the last 2 weeks. Abigail made the best out of a difficult situation. She did the best she could in the situation. I don't know if this was a prearranged marriage. I don't know how long she was married. I don't know what she'd been through with this marriage to a difficult man. But eventually she rose above her circumstances and she experienced a change of circumstances, so to speak. So if there's any, I mean, this can be applied. We're not just talking about marriage now, but women, men, anybody. I mean, God sees our circumstances, and she was faithful, and she eventually rose above her circumstances. Like God eventually took care of the issue. But in the middle of it, she didn't get bitter. She did not seek revenge. So hear me out on this. If you feel like you've got anything in your heart about anything that's good, unforgiveness, revenge, bitterness, we've got to purify that from our hearts, especially toward a spouse. We need to confess that. We need to get. I don't see that in Abigail. But I kind of feel like God used this to strengthen her character and build her faith. So here's the encouragement. God was with her, she was faithful, and her faithfulness paid off in the long run. Her character building, her faith paid off in the long run because God handled the situation for her, and she did the best she could do in a difficult situation. God eventually fixed it. He honored Abigail for her willingness to do what was right under difficult circumstances, hardship, and pain. And the word that the Holy Spirit was speaking to me is God will bless. He would deliver you at the right time. Like he sees and he's working. She possessed wisdom to know how to successfully calm David's anger and desire for vengeance. She learned how to deal with difficult emotional men. And my wife just laughed on that. She wasn't a victim. She was not a victim. She learned the power of her words and actions she took responsibility. She didn't just play the victim card. She didn't justify things. She said, what can I do that I can choose to do to influence my situation for positive and for good? All right. She was a peacemaker, and I always tell my wife this, like women probably have much more power than they realize with their actions and words if they just learn how to use it right. And some women have, of course, but I'm telling my wife and my, because I wanna please Kristen. Like I like when she's happy and I like when she's proud of me, and women can learn to manipulate the emotions of the hearts of their husbands. And then here's the last thing. Have you surrendered your marriage to God? Fred. But it can work for you, Fred. All right. Do you pray daily for your husband? Or do you focus on a laundry list of complaints? Have you surrendered your marriage to God? Have you asked Him to shape your marriage relationship and use it for His purposes? Have you relinquished your desire to control your spouse over to God and let God do the work in His timing? Or do you pray? Do you focus on the negatives or do you focus on the positives? That's a decision that you have to make. Hey, can you run back and get Mama? Because we're kind of ready for her. And I didn't give her a big heads up. But she has this little phrase. I'm not going to play the last song ever. I think I'll just. So, any other final comments, thoughts? David?
Just a quick question. Interestingly, this is back where I'm at my daily reading Samuel.
Really?
Just pretty interestingly, I look at the books. This book, as in Ruth and Judges before, have none of the authors. And for me, it's important to know who's a witness to these stories. Just I love them, but who wrote these stories? Who were the witnesses to the lives of these stories? Specifically in Samuel.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to your question,
No, I don't think it's an answer. I'm just a sort of question.
I would assume that since David was an author and Solomon was an author too, that this particular event was probably recorded, I don't know, probably written down, by Samuel, who knew David and talked to, I don't know. That is a very good question, though. How do we know what we know from the stories that have been recorded? The historical. I think I saw Jennifer's hand first.
I just wanted to tell you all that stuff is actually that guy who does the Mars and Venus, how men and women communicate.
Okay.
He talks about all that stuff.
Really?
So yeah, I was just because I looked at some of this stuff recently and I was like, oh yeah, no complaints and all that stuff. So how men have to feel like they're heroes, like they're always achieving and satisfying their wives. Not that they cannot do anything wrong, but that they're, just the criticism just take it away. It's hard to do that.
And did you have a final comment?
I was just going to say, I was looking in my study Bible and it says about the author of First Samuel. It says it possibly Samuel, but it also includes writings from the prophets Nathan and Gad.
They were, yes. They are mentioned in Scripture on multiple occasions, and it's being part of the royal court, and I'm sure that they were authors as well. Hey, Rebecca, what's Kristen up to right now? I should have warned her earlier, because I think she has something, and she wants to just have share a last word. I could kind of pray for us. Maybe any other final comments taking away from? I never preached on Abigail before, but I found it very interesting, kind of what I learned, and I feel like when I went through it with Kristen. Oh, okay.
They're still doing the cards, so they're not.
Okay.
But I just decided that if I can call this COVID, I was sick.
Pastor, is there an update on the twins? Are they doing okay?
Kylie has a new ventilator. There were concerns with the ventilator that she had, just with the way it was run. There's just different settings that they have with different ventilators. So they switched ventilators, and so far it seems as if she's doing well with that. Otherwise, no other updates. It just seems like there's something always with Kylie. Taylor's doing fine. She's growing, eating, doing great. So, that's it. All right. So today we talked about Abigail and Nabal, and I kind of always tease my husband when he's kind of cranky or
Grumpy.
irritable, or any of my kids or anything, that they're being lemons. They're kind of the lemon. And I was teasing him the other day, we were talking about Nabal kind of being like a lemon, and Abigail made lemonade out of lemons. And so I teased my husband, I was saying, I'm going to make lemonade out of you. And so, since Nabal was our lemon, I have some flowers, and I didn't pour the lemonade because I didn't know how you all would feel. So you guys can, moms can be for ladies, any lady. I can serve you, or if you would prefer, you can pour yourself. So I have one that I go around, the other one is lemon. And I'm going to serve you, I have to serve you, you guys can flowers.
Just stand at the door.
Oh, okay.
Right over there. And give power to the house. God, I see I see from a different perspective now what mothers and women have to go through in the context of their households and responsibilities and things that I never perceived when I was a child as a son, but I do perceive now as a husband and father. And I just thank you for mothers, and I pray for your special favor and blessing to be upon them today. But even branching out in a more general sense, Lord, with Chris's poem and thinking about women, and thinking about Abigail, and thinking about the trials and challenges and difficulties that they face. Lord, I'm praying that you would inspire us through Abigail's life to really rise up in faith and to embrace character building and development in the difficulties of life. That you would give us hope that if we're struggling in any relationship, that you see that and then you can supply the grace necessary to change hearts, to change our hearts, but also to change the hearts of a spouse or a friend or a relative or family member. So I'm praying that you would encourage all women, especially today, Lord, with your power to do a work in Abigail's life and also your power to do a work in their life as well as we look to you. So be a blessing to us today. Fill us and encourage us with hope and faith, we pray in Jesus' name as we conclude the service. Amen.
Amen.